They started coming over like it was open season. Loud trucks, beer cans on the walkway, their laughter chewing through the quiet I paid for. And I'll tell you straight up, you let people wreck your place enough times, something in you snaps. My name is Maya Alvarez. I worked nights in an ER for years. And if there's one thing late nights teach you, it's how much of your life you have to guard just to keep breathing. This is the night I decided I wasn't going to breathe for them anymore. I live on the edge of Willow Ridge, a narrow cul-de-sac where families and boredom meet, trimmed hedges, and two-polite fights over lawn ornaments. For months, a group of neighbors treated my backyard like cheap entertainment bonfires when the moon was full, fireworks that rattled the windows, and the kind of music that peels paint. I'm not an angel. I've left my share of doors unlocked. I've let life slide, and since hospital shifts wrecked my schedule. But when they started parking on my gravel, leaving cigarette butts in the hydrangeas, when they drove their ATV across the new soil my mother planted last spring, that was the line. You have to understand why it got under my skin. I grew up learning to fix what was broken, not let it be broken on purpose. My father taught me how to patch a roof after a storm, and my mama taught me how to notice when somebody needed a hand before they even asked. So when one summer night a truck barreled into my little gate and left a skid across my stone path, followed by a chorus of jeers, something that had been quiet in me my whole life, the part that refuses to be walked over, stood up. Act 1 plays out quick. The hook: a smashed planter, a missing garden statue, a neighbor video of a party in my yard where someone shouted over a mic, "Make way for the Queen of Willow Ridge," and then the laughter like applause. I called the HOA, which is its own kind of comedy. They mailed me a form. I called the police. They took a report and left me a pamphlet on de-escalation. My sleep was thin from shifts and worry, and the way worry grows teeth at night. The neighborhood meetings felt performative, people sipping coffee and saying, "Oh, what a shame," with no intention of actually doing anything. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole, the unofficial ringleader, 2 houses over, bourbon breath and a smile that always says he's not sorry, sent me a text. "Lighten up, Maya. It's summer." That was the last straw. Act 2 is the counterattack. And I promise you, I didn't go theatrical overnight. I borrowed patience like armor. I set a plan in motion that, on paper, looked like the sort of petty thing people call revenge on YouTube. In practice, it was something else: surgical, humane, and messy. I started with evidence cameras tucked under eaves, motion sensors disguised as birdhouses, timestamps that don't lie. I recorded the parties, the vehicles, the way Ethan and his crew moved like they owned the place. I learned their rhythms, their excuses, who paid for what, the web that supports entitlement. I gathered witnesses: an elderly neighbor, Mr. Harris, who'd seen them drive through his hydrangeas; Janine from the duplex across the lane, who'd been woken at 2 a.m. by shouting; and a woman named Lorraine who worked at the diner and had her own story about Ethan. But this isn't some vigilante story about traps sprung and doors chained. I wanted accountability, not just their shame at being caught. So I gave them a choice in a way they hadn't considered: show up, own it, and do the work to fix the damage, or I'd make sure the whole string of complaints and recordings found their way into places that would actually make them pay, like municipal fines and formal charges. I put it plain in a letter: we can have this out quietly. You can fix what you broke and we move on, or you can fight and we'll bring everything to light. That was when the real drama began. Ethan laughed when he first read the letter. "You a cop now?" he texted. "Or one of those internet lawyers?" He was sneering on camera later that week, and his arrogance had no idea how fast it would turn. They came to my yard not to party but to work, and I watched them as dusk softened into the kind of golden that makes muscle look hopeful. I supervised, a clipboard like a ridiculous baton. They scrubbed the patio, replaced the soil, fixed the hoses they'd pulled free. Marcus, who'd always been the quiet one, the guy who mowed lawns for cash and had a kid on weekends, though nobody in the group paid him much mind, kept stealing glances at me that felt like a question. Brenda, who liked to clap the loudest, muttered under her breath and tried to make a joke out of every shovel strike. Ethan scowled, as if the work was beneath him, and at night he hitched his truck and drove past slowly, letting the engine speak. But the heart of what I did wasn't just public humiliation or property repair. I wanted to force them, in small ways, to see what their behavior cost other people. I arranged evenings where they had to sit and listen, not at a church or a tribunal, but in places that made the truth unavoidable. One night, I took Ethan to the community shelter, just him and Amanda, A survivor who started the women's support group after her own life was nearly taken from under her. Amanda is not a sermon. She's blunt and soft, and when she spoke about the hours of silence after something terrible, when she described what it feels like to find your world rearranged by someone else's choices, Ethan's face did something I'd never seen. It dropped. I didn't chain him to that chair. I didn't force his eyes to meet every word. But I let him sit there, and Amanda told a story about a yard that used to be a sanctuary, about a child who didn't sleep because fireworks felt like thunder, about a man who lost his job because his ankle was broken when someone drove through his fence. The details landed like small stones. For the first time, the mirror in front of Ethan didn't reflect just his swagger, it showed ripple effects, people with names and faces. He left with a voicemail from me that said, "Fix it." Not for me, for anyone who had to hear the night. His reply was silence. The escalation at the center of Act 2 is moral, not violent. I could have called the mayor, filed lawsuits, escalated into the sort of legal war where no one wins. But what I wanted, selfishly, was a country where a person could go to bed and not be afraid the neighborhood would explode. So I pushed for remedial things, a neighborhood cleanup in daylight, a meeting where Rowan, a teacher, explained noise ordinances and the legal risks, and a weekend of community service at the shelter where anyone who'd been at my yard that night had to show up with a broom. Some of them dragged their feet. Marcus showed up sober. Brenda left early, crying in her car. Ethan sent someone in his place. And then, the climax, a night with everything on the line. I'd collected the footage over months, and a local community board agreed to a showing, not a public shaming episode, but a screening for neighbors and the HOA board, taped and documented. The video ran. The trucks, the discarded bottles, the kids jumping off my retaining wall, the fireworks, the laughter. It was not flattering. Ethan sat there like a man watching his own obituary written in real time. After the screening, I stood up, and I didn't yell. I told the room what it had been like to get home after a double and find my gate kicked open, to wake to glass where my wind chimes used to hang, to feel my home trespassed like a body. I said their names not in accusation but in demand and asked, plainly, how they would fix what they'd broken. Ethan finally spoke. He didn't apologize like it mattered. He apologized like it was a transaction. "We'll pay for the statue," he said, "and I'll keep him off your yard." The woman 2 seats down, the one whose kid had a broken wrist from the ATV the previous year, stared at him like she hadn't decided if she'll forgive. The HOA took votes, set fines, and required restorative work. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Ethan still drives past sometimes and still leaves that look, but there's distance now. My gate remains intact. So here's the messy part that sits with me. I want a kind of peace, but it costs something. I set myself up as arbiter, jury, and unofficial social worker, which is not a role anyone should expect to play. I forced people into uncomfortable corners and watched who softened and who hardened. Marcus started bringing over pies and helped build raised beds for the neighbors who couldn't bend, and Brenda started a weekly yard club teaching kids how to plant. Ethan, he learned to keep his music down and his truck off the grass. And sometimes I think he looks at his life and sees where selfishness carved out his days. Sometimes I think he doesn't. The end of Act 3 isn't tidy. I chose a path that was about repair rather than revenge, but it still felt like revenge a lot of the time. I had to ask myself, alone at midnight, if I'd crossed a line by turning people's mistakes into a public ledger. When I stood on my porch the week after the screening, the street was quieter and the hydrangeas were blooming again. A kid down the cul-de-sac waved when I passed with my grocery bags, and his mom mouthed thank you. That felt like a small verdict in my favor. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Boundaries are not cruelty, they're a kind of survival. But how we enforce them matters. There's a line between holding someone accountable and humbling them for sport, and not everyone who fixes a fence afterward has been redeemed. Some people change because they are confronted with consequence. Some adjust because it's easier than fighting. That's for the neighborhood to judge, and maybe that's the point. Real life doesn't hand you a clean resolution. It hands you choices and the sound of your own conscience. So tell me, what would you have done? Is it justice or overreach when someone like me gathers proof and points it out? Was I right to drag the mess into daylight? Or should I have let the systems that exist do their slow, often indifferent work? Drop a comment. Tell me which side of the line you stand on. Did Maya go too far or not far enough? Share the video if it made you think, and if you've ever had to stand up for your home, say how you handled it. I want to read those stories, the messy ones, the small triumphs, the ones that make you wonder about justice in a place where everybody knows everybody else's business.